But essentially what I wanted to do is just give you a very quick overview of some of the directions and initiatives within community corrections. So I think it's necessarily going to be fairly high level, particularly with the time constraints now. But essentially I wanted to quickly address some of the challenges that we face, some of the general directions in terms of the concepts that we're trying to pursue, and briefly cover over on some of the specific initiatives that are being put in place. I guess one of the things to acknowledge up front, which has become quite clear through the discussion today, is that we're not working in a perfect system. And although some of the things that I'll say, you'll go, oh yeah, right, I'll believe it when I see it, I can only give you my assurance that this is a direction that we're going in. Some of the stuff that was said by Robert just now, I would absolutely agree with and endorse, but we are working in an environment where there are restraints that we cannot control. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. It's not, I guess, a sellout in terms of where community corrections is going. It's just the practical reality of the environment which we have to operate. So I guess, first of all, just to acknowledge that we've just gone through a major restructure process, and there's been a lot of change in a very short time. I think some of the conflicts in terms of how we've operated previously are contributing somewhat to, I guess, a culture of uncertainty around what it is we're actually doing and why we're doing it. Obviously the things that Robert talked about I think are quite significant in contributing to that as well, around our uncertainty of how we manage risk and where that threshold is. Some of that change process is still ongoing, so as some of you will be aware, there's still I guess major changes going on, particularly in the offender management and policy arena, and there's still discussions ongoing, still negotiations in terms of some of the higher level objectives. So for example, there's currently a justice-wide project in relation to reducing reoffending in terms of what strategy, what direction are we headed in overall, not just in terms of corrections, but in terms of the justice sector as a whole. So first up, I think very important thing to acknowledge is the financial pressures that we're under. The practical reality is, I mean, we talk about how it would be great to have smaller caseloads. We know that. You know, it's something that I think is very readily understood, but CCOs cost money, and the money's not there. So it's something that I think is a very easy conclusion to jump to. That's something that we need to do. We need to have more staff, fewer offenders, we can do a better job. It's not a reality. So what we need to be thinking about is how we can work within those constraints to do our job better and target our resources more efficiently. Despite I guess, the common perception in terms of where we're at in the community, it's also worth acknowledging that the cost per offender for a community-based management has actually doubled since 2007. So we're spending more than twice as much per offender than we used to. So that's due to, there's a number of reasons for that. Increases in the CCO grade, changes to the staffing structure, additional positions, the establishment of costs, whatnot. And I'm not sort of saying that as a, positive or a negative, but it's something that we need to be aware of. We also need to be aware that there's alternative models being flown around out there. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Transforming Rehabilitation initiatives in the UK, where they're starting to outsource a lot of the probation and parole work to the NGO sector. I'm not trying to be alarmist. I'm not trying to say, this is where we're headed. All I'm saying is it's a reality that's out there that we need to be cognizant of. I think this has really been quite comprehensively covered already. One of the biggest challenges I think for us at the moment is this conflict in priorities. So the disconnect between the public expectations around what the media think, around what the public think we should be doing, and what is actually good practice. So some of the things that have been raised around, I guess, some of the bad decisions that we're making because we're risk averse. We've got really good evidence to support the decisions that we make. And the fact that the public don't always support them is something that we, and I say we, that there's I guess it happens at a couple of levels. There's both the CCO in terms of justifying the decisions you make with an individual, but then that's something that for the senior management team, we need to take up that argument at a higher level to try and influence upwards, as it were. And all I can say is it may not feel like it, but that's what's happening at the moment. One of the roles of the senior management team, so myself, Rosemary, the Commissioner, is to try and argue against some of these, I guess, pressures that are coming downwards from whether it's the media or the Minister's office. And of course, you're not going to be aware of those discussions, but they happen on a very regular basis. And all I can say is a lot of the issues that have been raised already are very well represented in that context. It doesn't mean we get what we want. It doesn't mean that the change happens immediately. It's a long process, but it is happening. Obviously, there's a conflict. As I said before, we've got a lot of pressures to reduce expenditure across government, and that conflicts with, as I said, the ideal around, well, how many resources do we actually need? I think another one which comes into that general concept of risk aversion is the short versus long-term priorities. So when we talk about risk, are we talking about the risk of something happening in the next week, or are we talking about the long-term consequences of sending someone back to custody? And I think that's something that, you know, for whatever reason, is something that we often miss, that longer-term picture. And I think that's really what Robert was talking about a lot when he said, you know, there is a risk involved with somebody relapsing into drug use. I mean, it would be ridiculous to suggest otherwise. But is it a manageable risk? And does putting the offender back in custody exacerbate the longer-term risk? But despite all that, the evidence is quite clear. Community corrections is more effective than incarceration. It's less costly than incarceration. There's a lot of research that supports the CCO as an effective change agent, by which I mean what you do in the interview room with the offender can make a difference. What you do in terms of referral support to the offender in the broader community can make a difference. There's a lack of evidence from these other approaches. So when I mention the transforming rehabilitation and say, oh, well, you know, they're looking at moving to the NGO sector, there's no evidence supporting that as an effective means of management. So we've got a lot of things going for us in that sense. I think we do have a lot of very skilled staff. I think it's unfortunate that not all of our staff, I think, are feeling that they have permission to utilise their skill sets to the full effect. And I think the other thing to be aware of, we certainly can't make any commitments, but there are several opportunities that are coming up, particularly with the rising pressures on inmate numbers, to have conversations that we couldn't have before. So that there's a shifting priority there in terms of, you know, trying to control that growth in the inmate numbers gives us an opportunity to say, well, hang on, we can provide an alternative. But we need to back that up with our actions in terms of how we move forward managing offenders. So in terms of the current priorities for community corrections, there's no real significant change in terms of the approach to risk management. And when I say no significant change, I mean that in the long-term sense. So there's certainly been a lot of fluctuations around the priorities sort of for the past few years in terms of the differing model of operation of CCMG, and I think certainly a change in the way that Community Offender Services, now Community Corrections, is operated as well. But essentially we're still doing the same thing. We're managing offenders in the community, we're doing it based on risk, needs, responsivity principles. Some of the details have changed, but that's essentially what it is. The priority for us moving forward is really about focusing on the quality of that service. So I think historically we've become very good, and I say this not just in terms of community corrections, but corrective services as a whole, of focusing on the concept of risk and perhaps to a lesser extent the concept of needs. I think we've perhaps not been as good in terms of addressing responsivity principles, so that is, it has turned into something of a cookie cutter approach in some contexts, which I think is something that we need to address. And I think the best way that we can move forward in terms of dealing with that is improving the understanding around what we do, what our role is, and why we do it. And in doing so, encouraging staff to use their skills more effectively, and also to improve the skill set. So within that context, one of the issues that I'm sort of seeing a lot in the current environment is misinterpretation. And a lot of assumption that's coming in. So assumptions around this is what's expected of us, this is what the policy is. I mean, it's not uncommon for me to get feedback on, I guess, policy that's out there that was rescinded a year ago. And I'm not saying that that's, you know, it is what it is. There's a lot of documentation there, and I understand it's not always possible to trawl through it. And I guess that's where I'm trying to get to, is that we're too policy and procedure focused. And so if we don't have the answer in black and white in a policy document in front of us, I think some of us struggle to make a decision in that context. So in terms of where we are heading in the future, I think the focus on an increased understanding of why we're doing it. If you understand the why, the details fit into place a lot more readily. Now, obviously, there's a bit of work we need to do in terms of better articulating that. It's a complex area, but that's where we want to go. So focusing on that process of decision making. So you make a good decision, you have good reasons for it, and you stick by it, rather than focusing on the black and white. So if we go back to an example that was raised just a little while ago, is the reporting of drug and alcohol conditions. Yes, you have to report if an offender is using. Can we change that? Probably not in the near future. And that relates to all these external reasons, which we have no control over. Do I think it would be a good idea? Of course I do. But that's not within my discretion to change. What we can change is how we respond to that, what our recommendations are to SPA, how we manage the offender when we put in that breach report. So when you put in that breach report, rather than saying, well, the policy says I have to report this, therefore it's a done deal. Well, the policy says you have to notify SPA. The policy doesn't say you have to recommend revocation, and it doesn't say you have to stop managing the offender. Now, I understand, again, it's not always as simple as that, but I'm sort of saying it, I guess, rather simply just to try and make that point. The other thing, I guess, that's really important to reiterate, and this sort of goes back to the previous context about being able to prove that we're effective, is that we still have an accountability that we need to adhere to, and particularly within, I guess, one of the directions for the current government. And I think it's quite reasonable. I mean, if we say that we're effective in managing, we need to be able to prove it. And if we're saying we're delivering a service, we need to be able to prove it. We need to be able to back that up to some extent. So it's not really good enough to say, well, we should be allowed to go out and do as we please and just give assurances that we're delivering a good service. We need to have evidence base, we need to be able to report, we need a framework for minimum standards. So I know, for example, there's a lot of talk about KPIs as being problematic in terms of everyone's always focused on KPIs, that's all that matters, it's all about just getting things done on time. And look, I think to some extent we have gone too far in that direction, but it's important to remember why we do it. So just as a really basic example to illustrate the point, there's a KPI on LSIR completions within the first 8 weeks. Well, why do we do LSIRs within the first 8 weeks? It's not because of the KPI, and it's not because of the policy. It's because that sound offender management requires risk assessment at the earliest possible opportunity so that you know what you're dealing with and you can allocate the appropriate resources to it. And you can identify the relevant risks and needs of that offender and start to engage with it. So I mentioned the KPIs. How many, just as more for my own gratification, how many of you are familiar with the standards for community operations? Those documents have been in place since the KPIs were put the current version of the KPIs were put in place. And I think that up until now historically they've been largely overlooked. Now the intent is that both of those documents are equally important. You need to have a quantitative element to what you do, that is you do it within a reasonable time frame, within the required policy and procedure parameters, but you need to have that quality element. So you'll all, of course, be familiar with the concept that you can do a case plan in 2 days and it's rubbish. But if you take 3 months to do a case plan, it's just as useless. Because you've got the offender, we know the failure rate's higher at the beginning, so we need to have something in place earlier on in that picture. So that's one, so the standards, I guess, provide that qualitative element, and there's going to be, as some of you will have already attended training in that respect, which is being rolled out through the OPRB. There's incorporation of the standards into the training through the academy. And there's a number of working groups which I'm sure you'll be aware of, one of which is quality assurance, which is really looking at how we get those standards ingrained into daily practice. And I guess from an overall point of view, the standards are probably more significant than policy and procedures. If you can meet the standards, I'd be fairly confident that you're doing a good job, even if you're not strictly meeting the letter of policy. I'd rather there was a good decision with good sound reasons to support it than somebody that's able to follow the policy to the letter and quote it back. As I said, that's being reflected in some of the changes to the training and hopefully through some further initiatives coming out of the quality assurance group. We're trying to increase awareness of some of the evidence base and the literature on which we operate, because I think all too often there's a policy and procedure that's put in place, and again that assumption, and I think Professor Tate sort of made some allusions to this, the policy happening independent of the evidence and best practice. All I can say is, I mean, that is taken into consideration in every policy. I mean, if you look at the current supervision standards, it's very, very easy to say, oh, well, you know, it's a very arbitrary move, a very arbitrary change. But really that is founded in risk needs responsivity principles. Because one of the key points that is, and I guess I'm not saying it's an exact model that exemplifies those principles, but they certainly inform it. Because one of the key things that we're trying to do with that is move away from this idea of thinking that that a serious offender is high risk, and differentiate that there are different considerations that you have to have for a more serious offender that don't mean treating them like they're high risk. And I wasn't going to touch on it, but Robert mentioned the Leary case. I mean, one of the things I guess that I'd raise there is he was medium low, you know, but we still managed him. We managed him based on evidence. We based on the assessed risk that was known at the time, all of the right factors. You know, you can't control for that. Even the lowest risk offender has a potential. If the probability is 1 in 1,000, then 1 in 1,000 will still go on to commit a serious offence. We can't control that. What we control is how we manage them, the evidence base that we do it on, and the reasons that we give for our decisions. And as that case exemplified, that was all in place. The reasons were there. And there was no, I guess, issue with that after review by Justice Wood. We're also looking at trying to improve some of the communication on this, because it's all, I guess, one of the things that I'd say, well, I'm standing here telling you these things, but you're only a fraction of the overall staff in the department. So it's important that we have multiple means of communication. And so one of the things that we'll be looking at, as an example, is a quarterly newsletter to try and address more around some of the current research, some of the current issues that are coming up, provide a bit more information and try and clarify some of these issues around, well, what is a good decision, what is good risk management, address some of the misconceptions that are floating around. And I think it's important to say that the Probation and Parole Officer Association can have a really key role in that. So I think the extent to which the association has the objective of increasing awareness, I mean, that feeds in with an understanding of the literature, and development days such as this are really important in feeding into that process. And I'm not saying that's part of the community corrections agenda, but I think we've got a good working relationship established, and I'd like to see that utilised sort of to further a common cause, as it were. So just quickly, one of the areas that I think we need to provide a little bit more clarity on, which has come up a few times, is the idea of what the outcome is that we're seeking. I mean, some of this comes back to the classic dual role of the probation and parole officer as sort of authority versus support, and I think it's quite clear that we've shifted it somewhat towards the authoritarian approach. But it begs the question, well, what are we actually doing? Are we about reducing reoffending? Are we about enhancing community safety, reducing the impact of crime? I mean, I think the current model that we're operating under shifts that question a little bit from the classic reoffending problem to say that, well, not all reoffending is equal. I mean, if you look at it in a strict sense, using an illicit drug is an offence. But that's clearly much less significant than committing a serious assault. So one of the shifts that we've had in terms of that outcome is to say, well, there is a difference between just reoffending and potential impacts on community safety. And community safety, I think, does need to be paramount, however you define it. And we can get into some arguments around what exactly that means, but I think as a basic concept, it's fairly sound. Now, within this, as I've said, there's one of the key problems that we have is that all these external influences that we can't control. Okay? We can't control what the Telegraph is going to print. We can't control what the minister's going to say. I mean, we can influence. We can't control what the commissioner is going to say. Again, we have dialogue, we have discussion. Sometimes community corrections is in agreement, sometimes it's not. What we can focus on is the things that we can control. So we can make sure our assessments are sound. We can provide good advice to the courts. We can provide good advice to our managers and directors in terms of what's going on the ground. We can adhere to evidence-based practice. Make sure that our community service work is efficient and accountable. And I think all of this is really coming back to a point that was made earlier around the professionalism. I think it was Robert that mentioned the reputation of community corrections as a professional organisation. A lot of that comes from what happens on the ground. And that doesn't need to be controlled, like I said, by what's happening in the media. I mean, that whole cycle is usually very short, has a very short attention span, whereas your management of the offender needs to occur over a long period of time. And you need to be confident that when you're making decisions around the management of the offender that you can justify them. And so that if you are called to court, you know why you made that recommendation. You know why you made that risk assessment in the report. And you can explain it. So what is the risk that we're managing when we talk about risk? I think that's probably underpins a lot of this in terms of when we say risk averse, well, risk averse from what? From what risk? So I think one of the things that we need to work towards is trying to articulate that better and understanding that there's more than just the short-term risk of an offender committing a further offence. So obviously that's a consideration, but then there's harm to the community, harm to the offender. So if an offender is put back into custody and locked up for 12 months, that has a detrimental impact on their well-being. Now that doesn't override every other consideration, but it's a relevant factor. It needs to be considered. The health and safety of staff is obviously a consideration. The cost to the community, including cost of crime, but also cost to the criminal justice system. So if we're putting people into custody, there is a financial cost attached to that as well. Again, it's not the be-all and end-all. It's something that we need to consider. In terms of, I guess, the overall impact on resources, one of the things that is worth thinking about is how we manage our own resources in terms of the offenders that we supervise closely and the ones that we don't. I know there's some varying views out there in terms of policies such as termination, suspension, whatnot for the lower risk offenders. And in terms of some of the other things that we do to try and manage. Now, bearing in mind we've got a finite resource base, we have to manage that risk. And the risk is that if we try and do everything with everyone, we do nothing. So we need to prioritise. And when I guess as a unit we say, look, the current priorities for community corrections are high risk, we're not just saying that because we're risk averse and we only care about high risk. We're also saying we've got finite resources and you can't afford to be spending your time doing these things that we just don't have the staff for. And again, I acknowledge that's sometimes easier said than done, but that needs to come into the thinking. The confidence in the justice system, as I alluded to earlier, there's different levels at which that occurs. So at a high level, there's obviously discussions at a senior management level and dialogue with the media that occurs in terms of trying to build up confidence. But what you put in your reports also contributes to that. So if you do a sound, well-argued, evidence-based report, whether it's to SPA or to the courts, that in itself builds up confidence in the justice system. You get improve your reputation with the courts, improve your reputation with SPA. That stuff matters. And it's about being honest and realistic in your recommendations. So don't say to the court or don't say to SPA that we've got this wonderful plan that's going to do everything. Be realistic. If there's limitations to the strategy that you can employ, say them. There's nothing wrong with that. It's better that we're realistic up front and then deliver on it than over-promising and delivering nothing, or alternately selling ourselves short, I guess would be the other one, and saying it's all too hard. And I guess within that, staying within the roles and responsibilities of New South Wales. So one of the I guess issues that comes up again, and this is again partly going back to the dual role, is, well, what are we doing? Are we a welfare service? Are we a police service? Well, no. So if we have a lower risk offender that has needs, is it our duty as a criminal justice agency to provide intervention for those needs when they may not be connected to the offending behaviour? No, there are other services for that. You refer the offender on and target the offenders that are in the criminal justice system or that have needs that are associated with them being in the criminal justice system rather than being incidental to that. Malcolm mentioned before the Law Reform Commission. So as many of you are probably aware, there was a review of sentencing completed in 2013. It's made a number of recommendations. None of them have been sort of progressed or implemented. It's still subject to ongoing discussion. But essentially what they do is provide a clearer framework, one of the recommendations is to move to new sentencing options, which essentially collapse all of the current orders. So rather than having section 9, 10, 12, HD, ECOS, CSO, we have a couple of orders which can then have supervision and community service work attached to them. So in my view, it's a good move because one of the things it does is it helps in that process of clarification. Because rather than saying, well, we've got an intensive correction order over here and a section 12 bond over here and these are very different things, it acknowledges there's one thing called supervision, another thing called community service work. Supervision's fundamentally about managing risk. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the recent report released by Boxar on the effectiveness of intensive corrections orders. But essentially what it did was compared intensive correction orders to periodic detention and supervised section 12 bonds. And while it found that there was a 33% reduction in reoffending for offenders on ECOs as compared to periodic detention, it also found that the rate of reoffending for ECOs and supervised suspended sentences was the same. So although it wasn't in the sort of thrust of the report, I think it provided very good sort of evidence to say, well, it doesn't really matter what the order is. The risks are the same, the decisions are the same, the issues are the same. So I'm hopeful that may, and as I said, it's still subject to discussion. There's no outcome in that respect. It may not happen. But I would see that as providing a much better framework for clarifying some of those issues because I think we've got lost, and it's easy to do. We've got a lot of complexity that's really not necessary. So I think it provides a good framework for clarifying that purpose. As has also been mentioned, there's a review of parole that's currently underway, so I think that's nearing its conclusion. And there are a number of other processes, which is one of the reasons why I think there hasn't been sort of a concrete outcome, is that there's still a number of other processes going on, such as the reducing reoffending strategy, number of discussions around strategies for dealing with inmate numbers, etc., which may influence some of those. So it's still an open, like I can't say it's going one way or the other, it's still an open discussion. So some of you will be familiar with some of the changes around funding models for NGOs. So a lot of people don't know that Corrective Services has provided funds to non-government organisations for quite some time now. And there's been some significant changes to the model in which that's been done. So that's under the Funded Partnership Initiative through PACE, so a number of projects which basically recruit NGOs to provide services. And one of the key changes to the funding model is that Corrective Services drive the NGO. So rather than simply referring to an NGO, we have some control over what services they provide and in what timeframes. There's also Campbelltown COSP, which is going out to tender. Honestly can't tell you off the top of my head where that's at. But yeah, Campbelltown COSP is being put out to NGO as well. So part of the intent of those changes is around increasing accountability for the services that NGOs provide to offenders, because as I'm sure many of you will have had the experience of referrals to services where the NGO doesn't want to work with them or doesn't provide the sorts of services that we want. There's also major changes, I guess, and it's not just within Corrective Services, there's major changes going on in the broader NGO sector and across government around reforms to how services are delivered and And I'm sure you're coming across some of those changes sort of, in your various locations as well. So there's a number of working groups that have been established as well, which I've mentioned. So they've got, I guess, each got different projects that they're working on. So quality assurance, which I've talked a little bit about. Parole units, looking at how parole units do their business, what the roles and responsibilities should be. I think there's a lot of confusion across the state. Well, confusion is probably not the right word. A lot of inconsistency in terms of different parole units and how they function and what they see their roles and responsibilities are, so clarifying some of that. Workforce planning, so looking at the equitable distribution of resources across a number of areas in the state. As I said, one of the key constraints that we have is the resources that are available to us, so it's important that within the limited resources that we do have, we try and ensure that those are distributed in a way that's fair to everyone, so we don't have one location over-resourced, another under-resourced. And there's some work that needs to be done in that, particularly around addressing changes and shifts in offender populations, which I think historically we've been not very good at dealing with. So the offenders change, or the offender populations change, they go up in one location, down in another location, we don't keep up. So one of the intentions of that is to come out with some strategies that will both ensure that we stay on top of that, but also empower the local officers a bit more to do something with that. We've got working groups in relation to first year officers as well, community service work, intelligence, satellite officers. So some of you would have seen the EIs that went out. I'd encourage you, if you're interested in one of those, apply for them. Joined up justice, which some of you have probably heard about. It's been dragging on for a very, very long time. There's some more movement to try and get that progressing shortly. So it's looking at a transfer of data between courts and corrections. So essentially what it would mean is that when an offender's issued an order, we get all of that data transferred through electronically onto OIMS. Yep. So that project's been dragging on for a while. So I wouldn't be saying it's coming in the next few months. If we're lucky, we might get something. But there's certainly movement in that area. There's new electronic monitoring equipment that will be coming out shortly to replace the existing equipment that we've got, which I'm sure again many of you had experience with problems with that. There's a project looking at introducing drug swipes, which is like an oral swab technology to replace current urinalysis, which is something that I think we need to be very mindful of the issues that we've got in terms of drug testing, because I think it will make it a lot easier to start testing, so we need to be cognizant of how we use that even more so than what we do now. We're looking at making changes to sex offender risk assessments so that we're not just relying on the static, which, as you know, once you've got it, you're stuck with it. So introducing the stable, which is a more dynamic, it complements the static, but it's a more dynamic risk assessment to try and get, I guess, a more responsive approach to how we manage risk with sex offenders. We're working with the corporate research unit in terms of developing a new screening risk assessment tool. So some of you may or may not be familiar with the GRAM that was developed by Boxer. It's essentially a risk assessment tool that uses existing information to give you an initial indicator of risk. So you use it as a triage assessment. So basically the idea is we can cut down on the number of assessments, full assessments that we need to do. If somebody's obviously low risk, we can then manage them differently. That's something which is being looked at the moment. It's early stages. They've completed a similar screening assessment for custodials. So again, I couldn't give you any sort of time frame for that or what it's going to look like, but that's something that's being considered at the moment. Video conferencing, so to relate to some of the comments that were made earlier, particularly by Robert in relation to how you engage with SPA. Well, yes, that's being looked at. There's been some pilots in relation to using video conferencing and having it input into every community corrections office across the state. The OPRB reviews, so some of you will be familiar with the Operational Performance Review branch. I'm assuming you're familiar with the KPIs. But they're, I guess, getting more active in terms of rolling out and doing reviews across the state, applying the standards to locations to provide that qualitative aspect. There's been a couple of pilots already, some of you may have been involved with them. The feedback we've had from that process has generally been very positive. And the thing that I guess I would stress with that, if you've heard of it, have some awareness of it, it's the Operational Performance Review branch. So they're out to review performance. Doesn't mean they're out to hit anyone with a big stick. It's meant to be a very positive process. It's around improving the quality. It's about getting engagement with the standards. And I guess providing an extra stream to that accountability so that we can report back and say, yes, you know, we're doing a good job, or alternately, look, we've identified some issues, but we're working on them. It's really intended to be, I guess, a mechanism to help you guys, not to sort of undermine or use a stick. There's been a bit of activity too in terms of research interest around community corrections. So we're working a bit with Boxar at the moment on a number of projects. So some of you would have seen research that's come out relatively recently in terms of intensive corrections orders, community service orders. There's a paper on parole supervision that will be coming out fairly shortly, which all show quite positive results. There's been a bit of a mixture within New South Wales around the supervised versus unsupervised issue. So from, I think it was it, I can't remember what year it was, but looking at supervision in 2002, they did a study which showed no sort of appreciable difference, whereas the more recent studies that we're seeing are supporting the idea that supervision is an effective mechanism for behaviour change. And then, as I mentioned before, there's still some ongoing changes with the offender management and policy division in terms of how programs are delivered and that as well. I guess in summary, the key direction that we're looking at is to focus on the qualitative, so the decision making over the process, having a better understanding of what the risks are and why we're making decisions, and providing, I guess, a stronger model for decision making rather than simply following process. We've got several initiatives supporting that, so trying to operationalise the standards, getting the OPRB out there, providing more information about current research, good practice, changes to training, etc. And then we've got a few other initiatives which are looking at some more practical things, you know, like video conferencing, electronic monitoring, the drug testing technology, etc. Okay, so yeah,